Hello everyone, I'm Captain Logan and this is Superhero Rewind. Today we get into that unfortunate category of superhero films that really should be remembered better than they are. Daredevil makes it onto a lot of worst of lists, and that's kind of understandable. It's a film that has nearly no story, terrible choppy editing, and confusing character motivations. It feels a lot like somebody paperclipped a bunch of scenes together that don't necessarily follow each other and called it a movie, and in fact, that's pretty much what happened. Nearly every complaint fans have with this movie is addressed with Mark Steven Johnson's director's cut. One of the producers decided it was more important that the movie move at a fast clip than actually make any sense, and obviously that worked out real well for it. I know there's still a lot of people who are entirely unaware of the director's cut, so I'm going to do this in two parts. Today I'll review the theatrical release, and next week I'll do a full review of the other cut. So here's the plot as the theatrical version stands. Matt Murdock's father is killed because he won't throw a boxing match. Matt had a chemical accident that took his sight but gave him superpowers, so now he's conveniently ready to devote his life to fighting crime once the inevitable tragic loss arises. He goes out at night as Daredevil, beats up and apparently often kills scumbags he doesn't manage to prosecute as Matt Murdock. He and Elektra fall in love because they had a lot of fun beating each other up in a park one time, but when Kingpin hires Bullseye to kill Elektra's father, she thinks Daredevil did it and wants revenge. She goes out after Daredevil at precisely the same moment as Bullseye goes after her, and she gets killed. Then Bullseye and Daredevil fight in a church, because we've never seen that in a superhero film before. Daredevil wins, even though his life has already flashed before his eyes. Then he goes after Kingpin and doesn't kill him because he's decided, after all, that he's, air quotes, not the bad guy. Now, as sarcastic as I'm being, I absolutely loved this movie when it first came out, but I was biased about comic book movies because there weren't so many of them at the time. Remember that this was the very next one Marvel did after X-Men. We hadn't even had Spider-Man yet. So think about what there was to compare this to as far as dark vigilante comic book films go. We had, 2.5 Batman movies and, The Crow? I'm the first to admit I had a fanboy filter over my eyes for this movie, but that all went away when I finally saw the director's cut. That isn't a perfect movie either, by any means, but it makes a lot more sense. I said this movie feels like a bunch of scenes paperclipped together. Let me explain what I mean with an example. The day after Daredevil kills Quesada, a rapist he couldn't prosecute, Matt Murdock is apparently hunky-dory and goes skirt chasing after Elektra after he hits on her in a coffee shop. So he's, this really tortured vigilante. And by the way, his girlfriend just left him through an answering machine message, but he's not so tortured that he won't just go after the next girl that smells good in a coffee shop. However, that night he beats up a thug who works for the Kingpin, and a kid sees him, and Daredevil tells the kid that he's, air quotes, not the bad guy, like he's trying to convince himself of this. The day after that, he decides Elektra is, quote, out of my league and I might as well end it before it starts. Now, I get why the night before is eating at him, but what does any of this have to do with his relationship with Elektra? He kills a man, and then hits on a girl, but now that the girl is actually talking to him, he gets whiny because he beats up a guy the night before. The inconsistency here comes from bad editing. The scene where he beats up the thug used to happen later in the movie, and now it's been spliced in a place where it makes no sense, and therefore Murdock's motivations are confusing. Mark Steven Johnson, who directed and wrote the movie, has a lot of good visual ideas, but he can't seem to figure out how to get these characters on screen together a lot of the time. As fun as the coffee shop scene is with Foggy and Murdock's banter, the way Daredevil and Elektra meet is extremely weak. What a coincidence! Kingpin hired both of their fathers, and soon will have had both of them killed. I realize Kingpin runs all the crime in New York City, but it still seems unlikely these two would just happen to meet randomly right before her father is killed. It's just a contrivance because the plot needs Daredevil to be implicated in that. And New York City here is apparently a lot smaller than the real one because all Elektra has to do if she wants to see Matt Murdock is walk around town for a few minutes and then she'll bump into him. And even worse, Murdock hears a thug beating someone up in the name of the Kingpin who he's, trying to bring down, and Murdock doesn't leave because he decides it would be more fun to go have sex with Elektra instead. Again, this is all because of thrown-together editing, and it's fun to note that the thug Murdock hears up on the roof mysteriously has the same voice of the thug he just beat up the night before, because that's where that scene is supposed to go. The biggest plot hole is at the end, when Daredevil and Kingpin have their big fight. They hear police sirens and Daredevil says, "Haven't you heard? Word's out on the Kingpin." Really? How did that happen? The only reason Daredevil knows Fisk is the Kingpin is because Bullseye, in idiotic supervillain fashion, told him where they were fighting. Nobody else knows yet. They couldn't possibly. That's because the subplot that was left out of this cut is all about Murdock following a trail that finally leads to the real Kingpin. But since we didn't see any of that, this is a plot point that makes no sense here. So, what's good about it besides atmosphere? Well, the casting is very strong. I'll talk more about Affleck when we get into the other cut, but Jennifer Garner I like a lot as Elektra. She's mysterious, she looks very natural when she's fighting and twirling her size, and she's got a similar no-nonsense attitude to the character of the comics. The movie knows how to use its comic relief well. Foggy Nelson is a character that exists just for that purpose, and Favreau is perfect for it. Bullseye is hilarious in a very different way, and the humor surrounding him is morbid, but great. We see him kill people with paper clips, peanuts, pencils, and all kinds of other stuff. A lot of people don't like Michael Clarke Duncan as Kingpin, and it is a very different take on the character, of course, but once again, his best scene was cut out of this cut, so I don't think he had the chance to really sell it. I also think fans would have warmed up to him a lot more if Kingpin had crossed into one of the Spider-Man films. It also has a lot of fun comic book homages, like naming all the boxers after famous artists and writers, Miller, Bendis, etc., and having Bullseye kill Frank Miller on screen. Also, Elektra's death is very close to the way Miller drew it in the comics, and Bullseye has similar dialogue. I also like all the perspective shots of Daredevil using his heightened senses. The movie does a good job of easing the audience into this idea, especially with the scene where the younger Matt Murdock wakes up in a hospital room and is bombarded with sound. It takes care to show us how Murdock copes with his blindness, things like folding money different directions so he knows which bill is which, but I also like how his powers can be another weakness. Daredevil seems to struggle with the line between justice and vengeance, which is handled well in places, but his motivations are out of whack with so much of the plot missing. He kills a guy at the beginning, then later, when Elektra gets killed by Bullseye, he throws Bullseye out of a church window, which almost kills him, but at the very end he spares Kingpin, who is really responsible for all of this. Why? I'm not the bad guy, he says again. What happened between the Bullseye and Kingpin fights that made him choose justice over vengeance? Because what he did to Bullseye sure looks like vengeance to me, especially since Bullseye got his hands shot up and couldn't defend himself anymore. Because of all these confusing plot holes and editing issues, I have to rate the theatrical release of Daredevil a 1.5. I can't recommend watching this over the director's cut, but I do recommend owning both versions because there are excellent special features on the theatrical disc, including a fascinating 1-hour documentary on Daredevil comic book history. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time for Part 2.